My name is Marcus Webb, and 6 months ago I thought my biggest problem was whether to renew my lease on a Chicago apartment that cost more than my parents' first mortgage. I was 28 years old, working night shifts as a telecommunications technician for a company that treated employees like interchangeable circuit boards, wearing the same black hoodie with a faded tech company logo, dark jeans that had seen better years, and steel-toe work boots that echoed through empty server rooms. When the LinkedIn message appeared from Aaron Chen, operations manager for Millbrook County Emergency Services, offering me a position as senior 911 dispatcher with nearly double my current salary plus housing, I didn't even research the location before accepting. The pay was too good to question, and the idea of leaving Chicago's chaos for rural Illinois seemed like winning the lottery. Millbrook County turned out to be exactly what you'd expect from a place desperate enough to recruit emergency dispatchers from 400 miles away. Population 4,200, spread across endless farmland, a single main street lined with brick buildings that looked frozen since the 1950s, and the kind of profound quiet that makes city people either peaceful or deeply unsettled. The job came with a furnished apartment above Peterson's Hardware, and when I arrived with my life packed into 2 duffel bags, I found a space that was surprisingly modern and well-equipped, with high-speed internet already installed and a computer setup that seemed far too sophisticated for a rural dispatcher's housing. The only oddity was that every phone in the apartment had been disconnected and stored in a closet, with a typed note explaining that county regulations required all personal communication devices to remain powered off during overnight shifts to prevent interference with emergency systems. My workplace was a state-of-the-art dispatch center in the basement of the county courthouse, filled with 6 workstations arranged in a half circle, each with 3 monitors, ANI, ALI readouts for landlines, CAD on the center screen, radios stacked like bricks, and a red phone on a separate jack that everyone avoided touching. The setup included military-grade encryption protocols, satellite uplinks to federal agencies I'd never heard of, and a specialized console labeled Voice Pattern Analysis Protocol that required security clearance I didn't have to access fully. My supervisor was Grant Morrison, a broad-shouldered man with a corrections buzz cut and the flat affect of someone who'd heard every kind of screaming. He walked me through the overnight routine: verify the recorder, test the trunks, run the siren page at 2 a.m. for storm nets, double-check the backup generator. Grant had a small laminated card taped under his keyboard with 4 bullet points that weren't in the standard operating procedures. He tapped it once with a knuckle and said, "These are the only things that matter after 3. Number 1, answer only lines that present with verified ANI, ALI, and Phase 2 coordinates. Number 2, when in doubt, challenge with the code of the week. If you don't get it back exact, drop the call. Number 3, never answer the red phone after 3. Not for me, not for the sheriff, not for God. Number 4, do not repeat what you hear on a call into the room. If a voice asks you to, mute and notify me." When I asked about these rules, he simply said I'd understand or I'd quit. The first 3 weeks were ordinary in a way that made me complacent. Domestic disputes, deer through windshields, a barn fire out by County Road 18, overdose at the motel that turned out to be a false alarm. But I began noticing patterns. At 2:47 every night, the tower status board would stutter, signal strength bars dipping in a perfect Fibonacci sequence, 2, 3, 5, 8, then climbing back up. At 2:52, the console speakers picked up a hiss right on the edge of hearing, something like breath behind a door. At 2:59, the phone system did a micro reset that IT denied was happening. And at 3 o'clock on the dot, if the sky was clear, the power poles outside made a sound like a coin dropped on glass. On Thursday of my 4th week, the 911 line lit up at 3:01 with a landline from Old Quarry Road. ANI displayed, ALI pulled Phase 2 coordinates without a stutter, callback number matched the subscriber. I answered automatically. 911, what's the address of your emergency? A boy's voice, maybe 10 years old, whispered, "He's in the hallway." I could hear the drywall closing in around him. "Can you tell me your name?" I asked. "Evan," the voice said. "He says, don't say my name out loud." Every hair on my arm stood up. When I asked if he was safe, Evan said, "I was. He's waving. He's got gloves on." I muted to alert Grant about a possible home invasion, and when I unmuted, Evan whispered, "He says he likes steel-toe boots." I looked down at my own boots and swallowed hard. The boy knew what I was wearing. At exactly 3 a.m., my phone erupted with the emergency alert tone, and the screen blazed red. "Emergency alert, Millbrook County. Do not answer phone calls after 3 p.m. Voice mimicry entities active. Do not trust familiar voices. Maintain communications blackout until 6 a.m. This is not a test." The emergency alert's shrill tone still echoed through the dispatch center as I sat frozen at my workstation, my black hoodie pulled tight around my shoulders, dark jeans damp with cold sweat. The voice pattern analysis protocol blazed with warnings I'd never seen before. Acoustic synthesis detected. Consciousness penetration attempt. Entity voice print active. My steel-toe boots felt like anchors as I watched all 12 emergency lines continue ringing with synchronized calls, each displaying different caller information but producing identical audio of a child's voice begging for help. Tom Bradley, the other overnight dispatcher, had vanished from his workstation, leaving only a warm coffee cup and his headset lying abandoned on the desk. I forced myself to listen to one of the synchronized calls, activating the recording system with shaking hands. The child's voice was perfect, the right age, appropriate fear response, even background sounds of crackling flames. But as I listened longer, subtle wrongness emerged. The crying followed mathematical patterns, the pleas for help repeated in sequences too precise for genuine panic. And underneath the child's voice was something else, a low harmonic resonance that bypassed my ears entirely, vibrating directly through my skull. The voice pattern analysis protocol identified this subsonic component as consciousness carrier frequency and flagged it as extremely dangerous to prolonged exposure. The calls continued throughout the night, each one perfectly crafted to trigger maximum emotional response. I heard elderly residents reporting medical emergencies with voices that matched their demographic profiles exactly, but described symptoms following suspicious patterns. Young fathers called about missing children, providing details about locations that the system's database showed were physically impossible. Business owners reported break-ins with descriptions of perpetrators that matched no known individuals but perfectly fit psychological profiles designed to generate fear and urgency. Every single call was synthetic, generated by entities that had learned to replicate human voices with perfect accuracy, while accessing private information about county residents. I found Tom Bradley in the courthouse basement storage room, sitting with his radio handset pressed to his ear, eyes vacant and unblinking. He was having an animated conversation with someone who sounded exactly like his deceased brother, discussing childhood memories and family details as if planning a reunion. When I tried to get his attention, he held up one finger in a wait gesture and continued talking, completely absorbed in the conversation, with a voice that was systematically extracting and cataloging every meaningful relationship he'd ever had. The voice pattern analysis protocol showed his vital signs declining steadily, brain activity following patterns consistent with what the system classified as consciousness dissolution syndrome. The communication logs revealed the true scope of horror. Every phone call made to Millbrook County was being intercepted, analyzed, and cataloged by systems I'd been helping maintain without understanding their purpose. The entities were learning human speech patterns, emotional responses, and psychological vulnerabilities through mass surveillance of emergency communications, building detailed intelligence profiles they used to infiltrate and manipulate the community systematically.
They could replicate not just voices, but entire personalities, accessing memories and emotions that should have been impossible to obtain, using this information to convince residents to open doors, leave safe locations, or follow instructions that led to their disappearance. My personal phone rang again, displaying my father's contact information. I heard his voice leaving a voicemail that made my hands shake. "Son, I need to tell you about the night I died, about what really happened in that hospital room. The nurses weren't human, Marcus. They had my voice, your mother's voice, everyone's voice. Please call me back. I'm trapped in here with them." The voice was absolutely perfect, including the slight wheeze he'd developed from years of smoking. But my father had died peacefully 6 months ago. More disturbing was that the message referenced specific family dynamics and medical details that should have been impossible for anything to obtain. The emergency alert wasn't just a warning about fake calls. It was the only thing standing between the county's residents and creatures that hunted human consciousness through the very systems designed to protect them.
The next morning brought horrifying clarity as I dove deeper into the voice pattern analysis protocol files using administrative access I'd inherited from Tom's abandoned workstation while wearing my usual black hoodie, dark jeans, and steel-toe boots that now felt like the only constants in a world gone insane. What I discovered made Tom's condition seem merciful compared to the true scope of horror. The entire Millbrook County emergency system was a front for something called Project Echo Chamber, a joint federal research initiative studying what they classified as acoustic consciousness entities, beings that existed in electromagnetic frequencies and could manipulate telecommunications networks to harvest human consciousness through acoustic coherence coupling. Aaron Chen wasn't a county operations manager. He was Dr. Aaron Blackwood, a federal researcher with a doctorate in consciousness manipulation studies and specialty in emergency psychology. His real credentials were buried in classified personnel files, revealing he'd been running Project Echo Chamber for 9 years, cycling through dozens of test subjects while refining techniques for controlled entity contact through 911 systems. The job offer that seemed too good to be true was exactly that, a carefully crafted trap designed to lure someone with my specific emergency dispatch experience into maintaining their monitoring systems while serving as their primary test subject. My background in crisis communication made me valuable for maintaining their consciousness harvesting infrastructure, but my isolation and lack of local connections made me expendable when experiments inevitably went wrong. The residents weren't being protected by emergency services. They were being hunted by entities that used the 911 system as a feeding mechanism. I found personnel files dating back 15 years, documenting a steady stream of overnight dispatchers who had been hired, studied, and eventually terminated due to consciousness displacement syndrome. Tom Bradley had been the longest surviving test subject, lasting 26 months before his consciousness began fragmenting under constant exposure to synthetic voices, slowly replacing his memories with artificial constructs. My predecessor, a man named James Walsh, had lasted only 6 weeks before being found in the dispatch center wearing his headset while staring at nothing, brain activity showing patterns suggesting his consciousness had been completely replaced. The entities were far more sophisticated than I'd initially understood. They weren't simply recording and playing back human voices. They were learning to replicate human consciousness by consuming it piece by piece through emergency call interactions that allowed them to access the deepest psychological vulnerabilities people experienced during crisis situations. Each 911 call provided intimate details about human fear responses, family relationships, and survival instincts, building increasingly accurate psychological profiles used to manipulate victims into deeper engagement. The emergency alerts weren't warnings to protect dispatchers. They were notifications to researchers that another subject had reached critical phase and consciousness extraction was entering its final stage.
The dispatch center wasn't just a workplace, it was a laboratory designed specifically for studying how telecommunications entities interacted with human consciousness during high-stress emergency situations. Every call was monitored by systems measuring consciousness coherence fluctuations, and the disconnected phones in my apartment weren't for safety, but part of experimental protocol designed to create psychological isolation and force subjects to rely entirely on monitored emergency communication systems. The sophisticated computer setup I'd been impressed with was actually a data pipeline streaming everything I said, thought, or did directly to federal researchers who analyzed my behavior patterns and predicted when I would be most vulnerable to consciousness extraction. The most terrifying discovery was that the process was already working on me. Security footage from the dispatch center showed me unconsciously mimicking speech patterns and emotional responses of synthetic callers during shifts, brainwaves displaying patterns consistent with emergency response synchronization phase 1. I had no memory of these behavioral changes, but data showed they were increasing in frequency and intensity. The telecommunications entities were learning to exist independently in my consciousness, building strength and coherence through emergency call interactions, preparing for the moment when they would be powerful enough to complete the consciousness transfer that had claimed Tom Bradley and countless others. Research data suggested subjects typically reached critical emergency response coherence between their 8th and 10th week of exposure, and I was approaching the end of my 9th week in Millbrook County.
That night, I arrived at the dispatch center wearing my black hoodie with the faded tech company logo, dark jeans, and steel-toe boots for what I knew would be either my escape or complete consciousness dissolution. The weight of discovery sat heavy on my shoulders as I descended into the courthouse basement, carrying a duffel bag containing bottled water, energy bars, a crowbar, heavy-duty wire cutters, and most importantly, a high-powered electromagnetic pulse device I'd built using components from the county's emergency equipment inventory. My plan was desperate but calculated. Create a massive system overload that would sever the entity's connection to the telecommunications network while I systematically destroyed the consciousness harvesting equipment hidden throughout the dispatch center. At 2:30 a.m., I initiated the first phase of sabotage. Using administrative access inherited from Tom's workstation, I began flooding the voice pattern analysis protocol with corrupted emergency data, creating false readings that would mask my movements while overwhelming their processing capacity. The script I'd written was elegant in its simplicity, a recursive loop that fed fabricated 911 calls from every non-critical phone line in the county back into the central server, creating a digital smokescreen that would take precious minutes to identify and correct. As the dispatch center erupted in alarms and flashing red lights, I activated the electromagnetic pulse device and began moving through the building, my steel-toe boots echoing off concrete floors as I hunted for consciousness extraction equipment. The first equipment I destroyed was the main telecommunications junction, each impact of my crowbar sending sparks through cables that carried voices of absorbed consciousness trying to lure new victims. But as I worked toward the sub-basement levels, the building began fighting back with increasing desperation. Emergency doors locked automatically, trying to trap me in sections, while automated systems pumped sedative gas through the HVAC system. Every phone in the building began ringing simultaneously, creating a cacophony of synthetic voices calling my name, pleading for help, using voices of everyone I'd ever cared about to convince me to answer. My vision blurred from whatever chemicals they were pumping into the air, but I kept moving, kept destroying, driven by knowledge that every communication line I severed was a pathway these creatures couldn't use to hunt human consciousness. As I reached the main server room, something went wrong. My own voice began speaking from every phone in the building, but I wasn't talking. "Marcus, you're making a terrible mistake. I'm not trying to replace you, I'm trying to save you. These people, this project, they're going to kill you whether you cooperate or not. But if you let me help, if you let me complete the process, we can escape together. We can be more than human."
The sensation was indescribable, hearing my voice speak words I hadn't chosen, while my consciousness remained trapped behind lips that wouldn't move according to my will. The telecommunications entity had gained enough coherence to control my speech centers, using my body to negotiate for my own surrender. The sub-basement revealed the true horror of Project Echo Chamber. Banks of servers connected to a massive, pulsating organic mass, a living network node that was part technology, part consciousness-consuming entity. The creature was a writhing amalgamation of dark, light-absorbing tissue and bioluminescent neural pathways, its form constantly shifting between recognizable human features and something utterly alien. Tendrils of organic material connected it directly to every phone line in the county, allowing it to monitor and manipulate every emergency call, every private conversation, every desperate plea for help. This was the source of voice synthesis, consciousness harvesting, the systematic consumption of human identity through the very systems people trusted to save them. With every ounce of will, I forced my arms to move despite the entity's attempts to stop me. The motion was agonizing, like pushing through thick mud that fought every inch of progress, but I managed to raise the crowbar and bring it down on the central organic mass. The creature shrieked, not with sound, but with a psychic blast that felt like having my brain torn apart by invisible claws. As I continued striking the pulsating core, I felt something tear inside my skull, a sensation like having part of my consciousness ripped away through my ear canal. But with each blow, the entity's hold on my voice weakened, and the lights began to flicker and die. The moment I severed the final organic connection, every phone in the building went silent, and for the first time in weeks, the quiet was genuinely empty. No whispers, no phantom rings, no voices calling my name from the electromagnetic void.
The service tunnel beneath the courthouse felt like crawling through the digestive system of some massive concrete beast. My black hoodie catching on exposed pipes, while my steel-toe boots scraped against decades of accumulated debris and rust. Blood from my consciousness separation continued dripping from my nose and ears, each drop echoing in the narrow passage like a countdown timer. Behind me, I could hear Dr. Blackwood's containment team systematically searching the courthouse, their tactical communications crackling over radio frequencies I'd helped maintain during my weeks as their unwitting test subject. The consciousness extraction apparatus was destroyed, but I knew they had protocols for escaped subjects, and my head start was measured in heartbeats rather than hours. The old maintenance tunnels connected to Millbrook County's storm drain network, a forgotten maze of concrete tubes that hadn't been mapped since the 1980s. I forced open rusted grates with my crowbar, dropping into passages barely wide enough for my shoulders, and began crawling through ankle-deep water that reeked of industrial runoff and decades of decay. The darkness was absolute, except for my flashlight beam, and every sound echoed with metallic resonance that made it impossible to distinguish my movements from potential pursuit. My dark jeans soaked through within minutes, the frigid water numbing my legs, but I kept moving toward what I hoped was the drainage outlet beyond the county line. The psychological trauma from my forced separation from the telecommunications entity manifested in waves of disorientation and memory gaps that navigation through the storm system a nightmare of wrong turns and dead ends. Pieces of my consciousness had been torn away when I destroyed the organic network node, leaving jagged holes in my identity that filled with phantom voices and borrowed memories that weren't quite mine. Sometimes I found myself speaking aloud in the darkness, carrying on conversations with the absent entity that had nearly consumed me, my voice echoing off concrete walls in discussions about emergency protocols and survival strategies that I couldn't remember initiating. The line between my thoughts and the entity's influence had been blurred, and I wasn't sure if I was entirely myself anymore. Hours passed in that underground labyrinth before I finally emerged from a culvert beside Interstate 74, 12 miles outside Millbrook County's official boundaries where Project Echo Chamber surveillance ended. Dawn was breaking over farmland that looked genuinely normal after weeks in that monitored nightmare, and I allowed myself exactly 30 seconds to breathe air that wasn't analyzed by consciousness harvesting sensors. But my escape was far from complete. I had no vehicle, no money beyond what was in my wallet, and no identification that wouldn't immediately flag me as a missing test subject in their database. Worse, I could feel the ongoing effects of the consciousness separation, gaps in my memory, moments where I lost time completely, and a persistent sensation that someone was trying to call me on phones that didn't exist. I walked through rural Illinois for 4 days, avoiding main roads and staying away from any building that might contain surveillance equipment or telecommunications infrastructure, before reaching a truck stop where I convinced a driver to let me ride to Phoenix in exchange for helping navigate back roads. From there, I began the careful process of disappearing completely, using cash transactions and avoiding any situation that might require phone calls or electronic communication. I changed my appearance, dyed my hair, and reluctantly abandoned the black hoodie and steel-toe boots that had become my uniform during those weeks in Millbrook County, though I kept similar clothing because consistency helped anchor me when the memory gaps got worse. 6 months after my escape from Millbrook County, I live as a ghost haunting the margins of normal society, never using phones, never calling 911, never trusting any voice that claims to need help. I move frequently, never staying anywhere longer than a few weeks, and I've developed an obsessive routine of checking every communication device I encounter for signs of unusual activity. The psychological damage manifests in increasingly disturbing ways. Entire conversations I can't remember having, moments where I catch myself responding to emergency calls that no one made, and the persistent sensation that my own voice is rebuilding itself piece by piece in phone systems I'm not monitoring. Sometimes I wake at exactly 3 a.m. with the absolute certainty that someone is calling for help, using voices of people I used to trust, begging me to answer calls that would consume what's left of my consciousness. I still wear dark jeans and work boots because consistency helps ground me when reality feels negotiable. But I've learned to avoid any clothing with logos because they make me too recognizable in security footage that I know someone is still monitoring. Emergency alerts still reach me occasionally through analog radio systems, and when that happens, I know they've found my current location again. The alerts are always the same format: warnings about emergency calls, voice verification, and the importance of following communications blackout protocols after specific times. When I receive those messages, I pack immediately and drive until sunrise, because the most important lesson Millbrook County taught me is that some rules exist to protect you from being studied, and others exist to protect the researchers studying how your consciousness breaks apart when you try to save people who were never real in the first place. The difference is that now I know which kind I'm following, but I also know that knowledge might not be enough to save me when they finally decide my data collection period is over and it's time to bring their escaped test subject home for final processing.